Chapter number 18. Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Chapter number 18. Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. The Egyptians have never submitted very willingly to the rule of their Semitic shepherd kings, and about the year 1600 of this era, or Anno Domini, a vigorous patriotic movement expelled these foreigners. Followed a new phase or revival for Egypt, a period known to Egyptologists as the New Empire. Egypt, which had not been closely consolidated before the Hyksos invasion, was now a united country. And the phase of subjugation and insurrection left their hull of military spirit. The pharaohs became aggressive conquerors. They had now acquired the war horse and the war chariot, which the Hyksos had brought to them. Under Thutmose III and Amenophis III, Egypt had extended her rule into Asia as far as the Euphrates, or Euphrates, if you will. We are entering now upon 1,000 years of warfare between the once quite separated civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Nile. At first, Egypt was ascendant. The great dynasties, the 17th dynasty, which included Thutmose III and Amenophis III and IV, and a great queen Hatassu, and the 19th, when Ramses II, supposed by some to have been the pharaoh of Moses, reigned for 67 years, raised Egypt to high levels of prosperity. In between there were phases of depression for Egypt, conquest by the Syrians and later conquest by the Ethiopians from the south. In Mesopotamia, Babylon ruled, then the Hittites, and the Syrians of Damascus rose to a transitory predominance. At one time, the Syrians conquered Egypt. The fortunes of the Assyrians of Nineveh ebbed and flowed. Sometimes the city was a conquered city. Sometimes the Assyrians ruled in Babylon and assailed Egypt. Our space is too limited here to tell the comings and goings of the armies of the Egyptians and of the various Semitic powers of Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia. They were armies now provided with vast droves of war chariots, for the horse, still used only for war and glory, had spread by this time into the old civilizations from Central Asia. In the picture, you can see the temple at Abu Simbel, showing the statues of Ramesses II at the entrance. Great conquerors appear in the dim light of that distant time and past. Tushratta, king of Mitanni, who conquered Nineveh. Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria, who conquered Babylon. At last, the Assyrians became the greatest military power of the time. Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Babylon in the year 745 before Christ and founded what historians call the New Assyrian Empire. Iron had also come now into civilization out of the north. The Hittites, the precursors of the Armenians, had it first and communicated its use to the Assyrians, and an Assyrian usurper, Sargon II, armed his troops with it. Assyria became the first power to expound the doctrine of blood and iron. Sargon's Sennacherib led an army to the borders of Egypt and was defeated not by military strength but by the plague. Sennacherib's grandson, Assurbanipal, who is also known in history by his Greek name of Sardanapalus, did actually conquer Egypt in the year 670 before Christ. But Egypt was already a conquered country then under an Ethiopian dynasty. Sardanapalus simply replaced one conqueror by another. In the picture, you can see the avenue of the Sphinxes, leading from the Nile to the great temple of Karnak. Photo taken by D. McLeish. If one had a series of political maps of this long period of history, this interval of 10 centuries, we should have Egypt expanding and contracting like an amoeba under a microscope. And we should see these various Semitic states of the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and the Syrians coming and going, eating each other up and disgorging each other again. To the west of Asia Minor there would be a little Aegean states like Lydia, whose capital was Sardis and Caria. But after about 1200 before Christ, and perhaps earlier, a new set of names would come into the map of the ancient world from the northeast and from the northwest. These would be the names of certain barbaric tribes, armed with iron weapons and using horse chariots, who were becoming a great affliction to the Aegean and Semitic civilizations on the northern borders. They all spoke variants of what once must have been the same language, Aryan. In the picture you can see the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, photo by D. McLeish. Round the northeast of the Black and Caspian Seas were coming the Medes and the Persians. Confused with these in the records of the time were Scythians and Sarmatians. From northeast or northwest came the Armenians. From the northwest of the sea barrier through the Balkan Peninsula came Cimmerians, Phrygians, and the Hellenic tribes, whom now we call the Greeks. They were raiders and robbers and plunderers of cities, these Aryans, east and west alike. They were all kindred and similar peoples, hardy herdsmen who had taken to plunder. In the east, they were still only borderers and raiders, but in the west, they were taking cities and driving out the civilized Aegean populations. The Aegean peoples were so oppressed that they were seeking new homes in lands beyond the Aryan range. Some were seeking a settlement in the delta of the Nile and being repulsed by the Egyptians. Some, the Etruscans, seemed to have sailed from Asia Minor to found a state in the forest wilderness of Middle Italy. Some built themselves cities upon the southeast coast of the Mediterranean and became later that people known in history as the Philistines. Of these Aryans who came thus rudely upon the scene of the ancient civilizations, we will tell more fully in a later section. Here we note simply all this stir and emigration amidst the area of ancient civilizations that was set up by the swirl of the gradual and continuous advance of these Aryan barbarians out of the northern forest and wildernesses between 1600 and 600 before Christ. And in a section to follow, we must tell also of a little Semitic people, the Hebrews, in the hills beyond the Phoenician and Philistine coast, who began to be of significance in the world towards the end of this period. They produced a literature of very great importance in subsequent history, a collection of books, histories, poems, books of wisdom, and prophetic works, the Hebrew Bible. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the coming of the Aryans did not cause fundamental changes until after 600 before Christ. The flight of the Aegeans before the Greeks and even the destruction of Knossos must have seemed a very remote disturbance to both the citizens of Egypt and of Babylon. Dynasties came and went in these cradle states of civilization, but the main tenor of human life went on. with a slow increase in refinement and complexity age by age. In Egypt, the accumulated monuments of more ancient times, the pyramids were already in their third thousand of years, and a show for visitors just as they are today, were supplemented by fresh and splendid buildings. More particularly in the time of the 17th and 19th dynasties. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor date from this time. All the chief monuments of Nineveh, the great temples, the winged bulls with human heads, the reliefs of kings and chariots and lion hunts were done in these centuries between 1600 and 600 before Christ, and this period also covers most of the splendors of Babylon. In the picture you can see frieze showing Egyptian female slaves carrying luxurious foods. Photo taken by Jacques Boyer. Both Mesopotamia and Egypt, we now have abundant public records, business accounts, stories, poetry, and private correspondence. We know that life for prosperous and influential people in such cities such as Babylon and the Egyptian Thebes was already almost as refined and as luxurious as that of comfortable and prosperous people today. Such people live an orderly and ceremonious life in beautiful and beautifully furnished and decorated houses, wore richly decorated clothing and lovely jewels. They had feasts and festivals, entertained one another with music and dancing, were waited upon by highly trained servants, were cared for by doctors and dentists. They did not travel very much or very far, but boating excursions were a common summer pleasure both in the Nile and in the Euphrates, or Euphrates. The beast of burden was the ass. The horse was still used only in chariots for war and upon occasions of state. The mule was still noble, and the camel, though it was known in Mesopotamia, had not been brought into Egypt. And there were few utensils of iron. Copper and bronze remained the prevailing metals. Fine linen and cotton fabrics were known as well as wool. But there was no silk yet. Glass was known and beautifully colored, but glass things were usually small. There was no clear glass and no optical use of glass. People had gold stoppings in their teeth, but no spectacles on their noses. One odd contrast between the life of old Thebes or Babylon and modern life was the absence of coin money. Most trade was still done by barter. Babylon was finally far ahead of Egypt. Gold and silver were used for exchange and kept in ingots. And there were bankers, before coinage, who stamped their names and the weight of these lumps of precious metal. A merchant or traveler would carry precious stones to sell to pay for his necessities. Most servants and workers were slaves who were paid not money, but in kind. As money came in, slavery declined. A modern visitor to these crowning cities of the ancient world would have missed two very important articles of diet. There were no hens and no eggs. A French cook would have found small joy in Babylon. These things came from the east, somewhere about the time of the Assyrian Empire. Religion, like everything else, had undergone great refinement. Human sacrifice, for instance, had long since disappeared. Animals or bread dummies had been substituted for the victim. But the Phoenicians, and especially the citizens of Carthage, their greatest settlement in Africa, were accused, later of immolating human beings. When a great chief had died in the ancient days, it had been customary to sacrifice his wives and slaves, and break spear and bow at his tomb, so that he should not go unattended and unarmed in the spirit world. In Egypt, there survived of this dark tradition the pleasant custom of burying small models of house and shop and servants and cattle with the dead. Models that give us today the liveliest realization of the safe and cultivated life of these ancient people, 3,000 years and more ago. In the picture, you can see the temple of Horus at Edfu. Such was the ancient world before the coming of the Aryans out of the northern forests and plains. In India and China, there were parallel developments. In the great valleys of both these regions, agricultural city-states of brownish peoples were growing up. But in India, they do not seem to have advanced or coalesced so rapidly as the city-states of Mesopotamia or Egypt. They were nearer the level of the ancient Sumerians or the Maya civilization of America. Chinese story has still to be modernized by Chinese scholars and cleared of much legendary matter. Probably China at this time was in advance of India, contemporary with the 17th dynasty in Egypt. There was a dynasty of emperors in China, the Shang dynasty, priest emperors over a loose-knit empire of subordinate kings. The chief duty of these early emperors was to perform the seasonal sacrifices. Beautiful bronze vessels from the time of the Shang dynasty still exist, and their beauty and workmanship compel us to recognize that many centuries of civilization must have preceded their manufacture. End of chapter. Let's move on to chapter number 19. Chapter number 19. The primitive Aryans. 4,000 years ago, that is to say about 2000 before Christ, Central and Southeastern Europe and Central Asia were probably warmer, moister, and better wooded than they are now. In these regions of the earth wandered a group of tribes, mainly of the fair and blue-eyed Nordic race, sufficiently in touch with one another to speak merely variations of one common language from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea. At that time, they may not have been a very numerous people, and their existence was unsuspected by the Babylonians, to whom Hammurabi was giving laws, or by the already ancient and cultivated land of Egypt, which was tasting in those days for the first time the bitterness of foreign conquest. These Nordic people were destined to play a very important part indeed in the world's history. They were a people of the parklands and the forest clearings. They had no horses at first, but they had cattle. When they wandered, they put their tents and other gear on rough ox wagons. When they settled for a time, they may have made huts of wattle and mud. They burned their important dead. They did not bury them ceremoniously as the brunette peoples did. They put the ashes of their greater leaders in urns and then made a circular mound about them. These mounds are the round barrows that occur all over North Europe. The brunette people, their predecessors, did not burn their dead, but buried them in a sitting position in elongated mounds, the long barrows. The Aryans raised crops of wheat, plowing with oxen, but they did not settle down by their crops. They would reap and move on. They had bronze and Somewhere about 1,500 years before Christ, they acquired iron. They may have been the discoverers of iron smelting. And somewhere vaguely about that time, they also got the horse, which to begin with, they used only for truth purposes. Their social life did not center upon a temple like that of the more settled people around the Mediterranean, and their chief men were leaders rather than priests. They had an aristocratic social order rather than a divine and regal order. From a very early stage, they distinguished certain families as leaderly and noble. In the picture, you can see a beautiful archaic amphora. Compare the horses and other animals with the Altamira drawing upon page number 54, and also with the Greek frieze on the page number 140. They were a very vocal people. They enlivened their wanderings by feasts, at which there was much drunkenness, and at which a special sort of man, the bards, would sing and recite. They had no writing until they had come into contact with civilization, and the memories of these bards were their living literature. This use of recited language as an entertainment did much to make it a fine and beautiful instrument of expressions, and to that no doubt the subsequent predominance of the languages derived from Aryan is, in part, to be ascribed. Every Aryan people had its legendary history crystallized in bardic recitations, epics, sagas, and Vedas, as they were variously called. The social life of these people centered about the households of their leading men. The hall of the chief, where they settled for a time, was often a very capacious timber building. There were no doubt huts for herds and outlying farm buildings. But with most of the Aryan peoples, this hall was the great center. Everyone went there to feast and hear the bards and take part in games and discussions. Cowsheds and stabling surrounded it. The chief and his wife and so forth would sleep on a dais or in an upper gallery. The commoner's sword slept about anywhere, as people still do in Indian households, except for weapons, ornaments, tools, and such like personal possessions. There was a sort of patriarchal communism in the tribe. The chief owned the cattle and grazing lands in the common interest. Forests and rivers were the wild. This was the fashion of the people, who were increasing and multiplying over the great spaces of Central Europe and West Central Asia during the growth of the great civilization of Mesopotamia and the Nile, and whom we find pressing upon the Paleolithic peoples everywhere in the second millennium before Christ. They were coming into France and Britain and into Spain. They pushed westwards in two waves. The first of these people who reached Britain and Ireland were armed with bronze weapons. They exterminated or subjugated the people who had made the great stone monuments of Karnak in Brittany and Stonehenge and Avebury in England. They reach Ireland. They are called the Goidelic Celts, the second wave of a closely kindred people, perhaps intermixed with other racial elements, brought iron with it into Great Britain, and is known as the wave of Brythonic Celts. From them, the Welsh derived their language. In the picture, you can see the Mount of Nippur, the site of a city which represents excavations have proved to date from at least as early as 500 years before Christ, and probably 1000 years earlier. Photo taken by Underwood and Underwood. Kindred Celtic peoples were pressing southward into Spain and coming into contact not only with the Paleolithic Basque people, who still occupied the country, but with the Semitic Phoenician colonies of the seacoast. A closely allied series of tribes, the Italians, were making their way down the still wild and wooded Italian peninsula. They did not always conquer. In the 8th century before Christ, Rome appears in history, a trading town on the Tiber, inhabited by Aryan Latins, but under the rule of Etruscan nobles and kings. At the other extremity of the Aryan range, there was a similar progress southward of similar tribes. Aryan peoples, speaking Sanskrit, had come down through the western passes into North India long before 1000 before Christ. There they came into contact with a primordial brunette civilization, the Dravidian civilization, and learned much from it. Other Aryan tribes seem to have spread over the mountain masses of Central Asia far to the east of the present range of such peoples. In eastern Turkestan, there are still fair, blue-eyed Nordic tribes, but now they speak Mongolian tongues. Between the Black and Caspian Seas, the ancient Hittites had been submerged and Aryanized by the Armenians before the year 1000 before Christ, and the Assyrians and Babylonians were already aware of a new and formidable fighting barbarism on the northeastern frontiers. A group of tribes amidst which the Scythians, the Medes, and the Persians remain as outstanding names. But it was through the Balkan Peninsula that Aryan tribes made their first heavy thrust into the heart of the Old World civilization. They were already coming southward and crossing into Asia Minor many centuries before the year 1000 before Christ. First came a group of tribes of whom the Phrygians were the most conspicuous, and then in succession the Aeolic, the Ionic, and the Dorian Greeks. By the year 1000 before Christ, they had wiped out the ancient Aegean civilization, both in the mainland of Greece and in most of the Greek islands. The cities of Mycenae and Tiryns were obliterated, and Knossos was nearly forgotten. The Greeks had taken to the sea before the year 1000 after Christ, and they settled in Crete and Rhodes, and they were founding colonies in Sicily and the south of Italy after the fashion of the Phoenician trading cities that were dotted along the Mediterranean coasts. So it was while Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II and Sardanapalus were ruling in Assyria and fighting with Babylonia and Syria and Egypt, the Aryan peoples were learning the methods of civilization and making it over for their own purposes in Italy and Greece and North Persia. The theme of history from the 9th century before and after Christ onward for 6 centuries is the story of how these Aryan peoples grew to power and enterprise, and how at last they subjugated the whole ancient world, Semitic, Aegean, and Egyptian alike. In form, the Aryan peoples were altogether victorious, but the struggle of Aryan, Semitic, and Egyptian ideas and methods was continued long after the scepter was in Aryan hands. It is indeed a struggle that goes on through all the rest of history and still in a manner continues to this day. Chapter number 20. The last Babylonian Empire and the Empire of Darius I. We have already mentioned how Assyria became a great military power under Tiglath-Pileser III and under the usurper Sargon II. Sargon was not this man's original name. He adopted it to flatter the conquered Babylonians by reminding them of that ancient founder of the Akkadian Empire, Sargon I, 2000 years before his time. Babylon, for all that it was a conquered city, was of greater population and importance than Nineveh, and its great god, Bel Marduk, and its traders and priests had to be treated politely. In Mesopotamia, in the 8th century before Christ and after Christ, we are already far beyond the barbaric days, when the capture of a town meant loot and massacre. Conquerors sought to appropriate and win the conquered. For a century and a half after Sargon, the new Assyrian Empire endured, and, as we have noted, Assurbanipal or Sardanapalus held at least Lower Egypt. But the power and solidarity of Assyria waned rapidly. Egypt, by an effort, threw off the foreigner under a pharaoh, Psammetichus I, and under Necho II, attempted a war of conquest in Syria. By that time, Assyria was grappling with foes nearer at hand, and could make but a poor resistance. A Semitic people from southeast Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, combined with Aryan Medes and Persians from the northeast against Nineveh, and in 606 before Christ, for now we are coming down to exact chronology, took that city. A Semitic people from southeast Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, combined with Aryan Medes and Persians from the northeast against Nineveh, and in 606 before Christ, for now we are coming down to exact chronology, took that city. There was a division of the spoils of Assyria. A Median Empire was set up in the north under Caixares or Saixares. It included Nineveh, and its capital was Ecbatana. Eastward it reached to the borders of India. To the south of this, in a great crescent, was a new Chaldean Empire, the second Babylonian Empire, which rose to a very great degree of wealth and power under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar or Nabucodonosor the Great, the Nebuchadnezzar of the Bible. The last great days, the greatest days of all, for Babylon began. For a time, the two empires remained at peace, and the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar was married to Cairaxes. Meanwhile, Necho II was pursuing his easy conquests in Syria. He had defeated and slain King Josiah of Judah, a small country of which there is more to tell presently, at the Battle of Megiddo in 608 before Christ. And he pushed on to the Euphrates to encounter not a decadent Assyria, but a renaissant Babylonia. The Chaldeans dealt very vigorously with the Egyptians. Necho was routed and driven back to Egypt, and the Babylonian frontier pushed down to the ancient Egyptian boundaries. From 606 until 589 before Christ, the Second Babylonian Empire flourished insecurely. It flourished so long as it kept the peace with the stronger, hardier Median Empire to the north. And during these 67 years, not only life but learning flourished in the ancient city. Even under the Assyrian monarchs, and especially under Sardanapalus, Babylon had been a scene of great intellectual activity. Sardanapalus, though an Assyrian, had been quite Babylonized. He made a library not of paper, of the clay tablets that were used for writing in Mesopotamia since early Sumerian days. His collection has been unearthed and is perhaps the most precious store in historical material in the world. The last of the Chaldean line of Babylonian monarchs, Nabonidus, had even keener literary tastes. He patronized antiquarian researches, and when a date was worked out by his investigators for the accession of Sargon I, he commemorated the fact by inscriptions. But there were many signs of disunion in his empire, and he sought to centralize it by bringing a number of the various local gods to Babylon and setting up temples to them there. This device was to be practiced quite successfully by the Romans in later times, but in Babylon it roused the jealousy of the powerful priesthood of Bel-Marduk, the dominant god of the Babylonians. They cast about for a possible alternative to Nabonidus and found it in Cyrus the Persian, the ruler of the adjacent Median Empire. Cyrus had already distinguished himself by conquering Croesus, the rich king of Lydia in eastern Asia Minor. He came up against Babylon. There was a battle outside the walls, and the gates of the city were opened to him. In the year 538 before Christ, his soldiers entered the city without fighting. The crown prince Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, was feasting, the Bible relates, when a hand appeared and wrote in letters of fire upon the wall these mystical words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which was interpreted by the prophet Daniel, whom he summoned to read the riddle, as God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting, and thy kingdom is given to the Medes and Persians. Possibly the priests of Bel-Marduk knew something about that writing on the wall. Belshazzar was killed that night, says the Bible. Nabonidus was taken prisoner, and the occupation of the city was so peaceful that the services of Bel-Marduk continued without intermission. In the picture you can see a Persian monarch from the ruins of Persepolis, photo taken by Miss F. Bix. Thus it was the Babylonian and Median empires were united. Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, subjugated Egypt. Cambyses went mad and was accidentally killed, and was presently succeeded by Darius the Mede, Darius I, the son of Hystaspes, one of the chief counselors of Cyrus. In the picture you can see the ruins of Persepolis, the capital city of the Persian Empire, burned by Alexander the Great. Photo taken by Major W. F. P. Roth. In the picture you can see the great porch of Xerxes at Persepolis. Photo taken by Major W. F. P. Roth. The Persian Empire of Darius I, the first of the new Aryan empires and the seat of the old civilization, was the greatest empire the world had hitherto seen. It included all Asia Minor and Syria, all the old Assyrian and Babylonian empires, Egypt, the Caucasus and Caspian regions, Media, Persia, and it extended into India as far as the Indus. Such an empire was possible because the horse and rider and the chariot and the made road had now been brought into the world. Hitherto the ass and ox and the camel for desert use had afforded the swiftest method of transport. Great arterial roads were made by the Persian rulers to hold their new empire, and post horses were always in waiting for the imperial messenger or the traveler with an official permit. Moreover, the world was now beginning to use coin money, which greatly facilitated trade and intercourse. But the capital of this vast empire was no longer Babylon. In the long run, the priesthood of Bel-Marduk gained nothing by their treason. Babylon, though still important, was now a declining city. and the great cities of the new empire were Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana. The capital was Susa. Nineveh was already abandoned and sinking into ruins. End of chapter.